Is that Kevin Starr?
So do you see, hey, Ricky, do you see that one of the guys in our group is named Kevin Starr?
I do. Is that a joke?
Nope. He's one of my best friends. And he and the historian Kevin Starr used to get each other's mail.
Oh, that's funny. I've actually got a fan in Connecticut named Richard Kreitner who's actually logged into some of these talks that I've given on the book.
Wow.
That's funny. All right, cool.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Michael. I'm the events host and coordinator and publicist for Annie Bloom's books. Thanks for making the time to show up this evening for this wonderful event. I don't know where all you guys are from, but if you're not familiar with the Portland area or Annie Bloom's, we're located in a neighborhood called Multnomah Village that's in Portland. We've been open for about 40 years or so, and we're still plugging along despite everything that's going on. Our store is currently closed to browsing in case you're local and we're trying to get in the front door, but we do have staff there every day from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. to answer questions and on the phone and do email orders and web orders. So you're able to order Richard Kreitner's book, for instance, and get that shipped out, or you can come by and pick it up. We have some great events coming up. On Thursday, we have local luminaries Joanna Rose and Stephen Allred. Joanna's got a brand new book out. They are the co-facilitators of the Portland writing group, the Pinewood Table. It should be a really good event. And let's see, we've got Charles Subi on the 15th. He's a short story writer from Hawaii. And on the 20th, we have Scott Nadelson with his new story collection, One of Us. And on the 27th, another couple of local luminaries from Portland, David Byspiel, who runs the Attic Writers Workshop, and Vanessa Veselka, who's got a brand new novel out. It's good stuff. You can check our events page and learn more about those things. Tonight, we're delighted to be hosting Richard Kreitner, who is in conversation with Daniel Duane. We have pre-signed copies, I believe, now available of Richard's book. So you can, once again, head over to annieblooms.com and order up those books. Even if you already have copies, order them for friends and family. Start shopping now for the holidays. We have free gift wrapping. After they have their conversation, there will be a Q&A session, so feel free to write some questions in the chat and I'll ask these gentlemen some questions. So, Richard Kreitner, born in Queens, he grew up in Wayne, New Jersey and studied philosophy at McGill University in Montreal. After graduating, he drove around the country with his now wife for 4 months. That includes a stop right near Annie Bloom's books, he was telling me earlier. Since 2012, he has been affiliated with The Nation as intern editor and writer. He has also published essays, reviews, and articles in Slate, Raritan, The Baffler, The Boston Globe, The New York Review of Books, and The New York Times. His books are Break It Up, obviously, that's what we're here for, and Booked, A Traveler's Guide to Literary Locations Around the World. That came out in 2019. He also writes Only United in Name, an occasional newsletter about politics and history. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife, daughter, and son. So, Break It Up. The thesis is simple. The United States has never lived up to its name and never will. The novel and fiery thesis of Break It Up is simple. The United States, sorry, I just read that part. That's the thesis. From the cold Civil War that pits partisans against one another to the modern secession movement in California and Texas, and probably tangentially up here in the Northwest, the divisions that threaten to tear America apart today have centuries-old roots in the earliest days of our republic. Richly researched and persuasively argued, Break It Up will help readers make fresh sense of our fractured age. And then we also have Daniel Duane here. He has written for the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Sunday Review, California Sunday Magazine, Wired, GQ, Esquire, Men's Journal, Outside, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, and many other publications. He is the author of 6 books, including surfing memoir, Caught Inside, and his work has been widely anthologized. Daniel holds a PhD in American Literature from UC Santa Cruz and has taught writing for the Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference, University of California, Santa Cruz, and the MFA program at San Francisco State University. He lives in San Francisco with his wife, the writer Elizabeth Weil. Is that right, Weil?
Weil.
Weil, sorry. I knew I was gonna get that wrong.
Sure.
With Elizabeth Weil and their 2 daughters. Welcome.
Thank you.
Right on, thanks a lot. So I'll just get us going here by saying, Ricky, that I'm sorry, Richard, that I'm honestly knocked out by this book. I really am. I think it's beautifully and powerfully written. I'm super impressed by the combination of the breadth of scholarship and the sort of narrative drive. That it has great narrative drive. So this book does a really remarkable combination of things where it tells it's the best kind of sort of enjoyable narrative history for a general audience. So it's just really a kick to read as fun. As sort of fun American history, and particularly it's sort of a wonderful kind of history to read in the sense that it's the sort of just slightly different slice of all these events that one thinks of oneself as really understanding and knowing. So you sort of go through one aspect of American history after another: the Revolution, the conquest of the West, the Civil War, thinking something about it, and we get this different take on it from you. And then the way that you've driven all of this toward that final section that is about, sort of, really connecting it to what we're all going through now is remarkably powerful and really shows your, it really shows your experience as the journalist that you've been, because it's really unusual and interesting to see such an accomplished work of history end on such a powerful sort of polemical wrestling with the present tone. So bravo. But then to sort of talk our way through it a little bit, one of the things I was really kind of intrigued by was your thesis and your reading of the revolutionary period as having been sort of making this case that in a way disunion is sort of as much in the DNA of the United States as union, if not more so, that the revolution in a way can be seen as an act of secession and disunion. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that nice words about the book. I won't pretend I didn't work hard on it. And I also kind of feel like I hit the jackpot in that a few years ago I had this kind of supposition that this theme was returning to American politics, and then shortly after I began work on it with the 2016 election, I had this massive confirmation that indeed it was. The revolution, comes 150 years into my book, my story, and the American story, which is a really massive amount of time. We often, I think, in these kind of, AP or, American History 101 surveys, kind of skip over the colonial period quite quickly, but it was 150 years, the same amount of time, more or less since the Civil War. And that's 150 years where Americans were not united. So, you say that disunion was kind of at the beginning in the Americans' political DNA. It quite literally was, the Mayflower, which set sail exactly 400 years ago, this season. We consider the passengers on that ship pilgrims, but that's not what they called themselves. They called themselves separatists because they wanted to secede from the Church of England and establish their own independent congregations. The Mayflower is not necessarily the only way to begin the American story, obviously, but it's kind of the classic way. And there's separatism right there at the very beginning. And for 150 years, the colonists resist every effort to form a union. It's not because nobody thought of it. It's because they had no interest in doing so. They saw union as the enemy, as what they had left the old world to get away from. They were after independence and separation. And they resist every attempt to try to get them to form a union. Benjamin Franklin in 1754 puts forward the Albany Plan of Union, the first kind of fully formed plan for forming a federation of the American colonies. And his famous political cartoon, Join or Die, is kind of remembered or assumed to have been some kind of premonition of American unity that eventually grew up, about 20 years later during the Revolution. What we forget is that Americans rejected that plea. Given the choice between union and death, they chose to take the risk of death because they wanted nothing to do with joining together. And once the Revolution comes around, to get to your question, union is not the point. They weren't, rebelling so they could form a union. They formed a union so that they could rebel and do so successfully, because they would have had no chance if they had done it alone. Union was then a means to an end and not an end in itself. And that embedded a certain fragility, I think, in it from the very beginning. And there's other weaknesses at the time. You know, when Abraham Lincoln's great theory, to skip ahead, was that the Union was created before the states, that the Union existed before the states declared independence, that it was the result of the 1774 Articles of Association, which was a boycott against Britain, which the Continental Congress gave a certain coercive power. And it was that coercive power that, in his theory, kind of nationalistic theory, created the Union. But if you actually look, and you know, this is the story I tell for this part of the book, if you actually look, South Carolina threatened to secede and from that early Union and not ratify those articles if rice and indigo were included in the boycott. In any case, they basically got their way. And what that shows is that secession threats tend to succeed, that if you threaten to walk away from the Union, you're very likely to get what you want. And there again, we see fragility embedded in the very foundations of the Union.
It's the other, you know, as a Westerner, as a Californian with family from Oregon, you know, the Western part of your narrative is particularly wonderful and interesting to me. The little and some of it as a Californian, I was well aware of the Bear Flag Republic. I mean, you know, that's not far. I'm in San Francisco right now, so that's nearby. And I was somewhat aware of the secessionist, the Confederate sympathy, the sort of widespread Confederate sympathy, particularly in Southern California in the years leading up to the Civil War. But I really had no idea just how sort of diverse and widespread secessionist impulses were in the Western territories. And that part feels to me particularly related to what we're struggling with now, but I guess it would feel that way to me because of where I am. But talk about that a little bit, that Western period, you know, the sort of Civil War period, but really these ways. I guess what I'm trying to say is the Civil War narrative is interesting to me for its own sake, but part of what's fascinating is to see the degree to which this narrative of North versus South kind of collapses a lot of the complexity that was there politically. And we see that complexity, you know, in your chapters about the West.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. That's probably one of my favorite, you know, or most startling discoveries was how open things were in the American, you know, Union up to the Civil War, and then after it's a separate story, which we could talk about. But you know, and it's all covered over by this phrase "manifest destiny," where it's assumed to have been inevitable that the United States was going to march across the continent and take everything, and we ascribe that attitude to even, you know, somebody as early as Thomas Jefferson. But when you actually look at what Jefferson thought, you know, when he made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he was ambivalent about whether those lands became part of the United States. He actually wrote to somebody right afterwards and said it didn't matter to him as long as it was founded by, you know, English-speaking Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, Americans, but it didn't need to be part of the United States. So there's this radical openness, even at the very dawn of the 19th century, which lasts well into the 1840s and the 1850s. You know, a lot of people thought it was inevitable that California and Oregon would form their own independent, you know, nation, a separate Pacific Republic, they called it. Daniel Webster, you know, famous for liberty and union, one and inseparable, made an exception for California and for Oregon, where he thought that a separate Pacific Republic would presumably be devoted to liberty, but would actually be separate from the United States. And they'd be allies, but separate nations. And on the ground, this was an extremely popular, you know, belief. People left, you know, everyone forgets that when you got onto the Oregon Trail, you were leaving the United States, intentionally so, and you were okay with that. You know, and they weren't going there to save Oregon. That's kind of the story that people tell, but there's nothing in the records of that at the time. They actually were okay with, and at times, you know, rallied around the idea of forming an independent nation. And you know, that took different forms. It would either be California by itself or California united with Oregon and what's now Washington. But there are, you know, different versions of that idea. I got especially interested in this after the 2016 election, of course, when there's this, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this, you know, this rise in support for Calexit, and also even in Oregon for secessionism.
Well, let's make that. I mean, let's go ahead and make that jump, because I was really as a journalist at the time, I had this, and some of this, that was fun for me to revisit this part of your book. As a journalist at the time, I had this really peculiar experience with that Calexit thing, where you and I have talked about this a bit, but where, on the day after the election, I sort of woke up the next day in this fervor of, Shervin Peshawar, the tech guy, was tweeting that he was going to fund a California separatist movement, the founding of a state here. It was the first time I thought, why are we a part of this? What the hell is this? Why are we a part of this union anymore? This isn't this isn't making any sense for us. And I started to see stuff in the news about it, and I heard about that Yes California movement. And I was working on a piece, about California, what it felt like to be a Californian in going through that election. And so I reached out to the Yes California people, just kind of looking to hear what they were all about. And that guy you mentioned in your book, Louis Marinelli, I think I just went to the Facebook page of Yes California. I just did your, basic Google search, and I'm on the Facebook page, and I send the guy a message, hey, yes, can I talk to you? I'm really interested in this. And what I get back is a Facebook message saying, yeah, sure, delighted to talk. Can we use Skype? I'm actually in Russia right now. Wow, far out, right? So the next thing I know, as all this news is breaking about the Russian disinformation campaigns in the election, I'm on a Skype call with a guy who's in St. Petersburg, Russia, advocating for California to secede from the Union. And it's clear that he's not really spent very much time in California. I don't think he's native California. Yeah, he's from New York. Is that where he's from?
Yeah, upstate.
Yeah. So he's telling me this on the phone. So as I'm on the phone with him, I'm thinking, or on this Skype call, I'm thinking, what on earth have I just stumbled into? And it's interesting, you describe a kind of people getting cold feet about the Calexit movement. Well, I was one of those people. I got pretty creeped out by what I had touched up against. And I really backed away from the whole thing. And I did pitch a few magazine editors along the score of I don't want to do this unless we're going to do this for real. Cause I don't want to, but by myself be dabbling around with Russian intelligence operatives who are trying to foment. But anyway, so, and Peshawar too, I traded Twitter messages with Peshawar wanting to interview him. And then he went silent all of a sudden. He must've gotten some, he woke up too to oh, this is much creepier than I want to be involved.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of different angles to take on this. It actually went so far that, and maybe some people will remember this, that guy Marinelli actually opened up an embassy in Moscow, an embassy of the Independent Republic of California, which is this ridiculous publicity stunt, which was funded by the Kremlin. It was the Russia's support for movements in California, in Texas, and elsewhere in the United States was part of this 2016, meddling in American politics, which actually didn't really cost that much money and created some degree of trouble. I mean, the United States survived it, obviously. But there's one episode that I talk about in the book where Russia set up a Facebook page called Heart of Texas, which was a secessionist, group, and put out a bunch of memes, often in broken English, that people would pass around. And they stoked this demonstration in Houston outside of a mosque that was opening, where they also created the group that was on the mosque side of this clash.
Oh, I remember this story.
There's a Senate report about this that shows that Russia seeded both of these groups to actually get in the actual streets. Some of them holding weapons, glaring at each other across a line of police officers, and it cost $250 or something. This thing that could cause trouble. But the other thing is that, my aunt lives in California, in Orange County, and she thought that when I told her about this project, that I was first pursuing it in 2014, 2015, she thought it was absurd. And I was kind of ruining my career by, getting into this kind of fringe idea. But as with you, and I'm sure lots of people that after the 2016 election, she kind of saw that I was kind of onto something. And even if that impulse was transient or fleeting, And even if the Kalexit movement collapsed because of this kind of Russian whatever, the impulse is real. It is there, and I think it's growing with every election on one side or the other. After 2012, it was the right, and in Texas, where they were starting to talk about secession. But I think this indicates that there is something going on beneath the surface of American politics, where our union might not be as stable as we've been taught for many decades, even more than a century now, to believe. And one other angle I want to mention on that Russia thing. Yes, it seems inherently illegitimate for a secessionist movement to be funded and working with America's foreign policy foes. But the American Revolution would not have succeeded without French intervention as well. It's kind of a standard practice when you're trying to cause trouble in your country or even break away from it. It's not inherently outside the bounds of legitimate politics. It seems to me, that which again shows, the American Revolution was a secessionist movement, and we, speaking of Americans then, indulged in certain practices such as violence, such as allying with our former enemies in order to get the job done. Provocative thought.
Yeah, right. Sort of an alarming thought. So why don't we? It has felt to me between sort of immediately after the 2016 election and right after Trump took office, I guess I feel like the sanctuary city stuff was the first real expression of this. But it really did feel and has continued in some ways to feel like the Trump administration was going to try to deprive California of funding for this and that. And it is my understanding that California has been a net donor state to the federal treasury since the 1980s. And I have, I have, as a lot of us have had occasion to wonder in recent years, how long can a polity hold together in which California, 40 million people, fifth largest economy in the world, overwhelmingly, these days now, not always, but now overwhelmingly liberal in its politics. How long can a state like that, and then of course there's parts of Oregon that are that way, parts of Washington, how long can people steeped in the American tradition, which is to say raised in American public schools, taught to value representative democracy, which may turn out to have been a big mistake of our public schooling system, but sort of taught to imagine that we live with representative democracy at the federal level. How long can a polity of people raised and steeped in that tradition really put up with the sort of unequal representation that we are increasingly heading towards?
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that. I think not forever, I think is the implied answer, and it is the right answer. In my kind of thinking, my schema, slavery is what broke the Union once. Minority rule is what might break it again. Constitutional mechanisms like the Electoral College, like the Senate, and the Supreme Court, and I think a House of Representatives that is far too small, and through gerrymandering and other ways, unequally balanced, unequally weighted against the national political majority. That can't last forever, and I don't think it's going to. For how long will California be willing to submit to a system in which each vote for a senator has 1/70th the potency of a vote for senator in Wyoming? And there's similar imbalances, not quite as drastic, in the Electoral College. I don't think forever. And Trump was blocked from cutting off funding to California, as I understand it, mostly through the courts, right? It wasn't for lack of trying.
Yeah.
And now Republicans have stacked the courts in a way that's going to be extremely concerning, to say the least, for several decades, unless the Democrats do something about that. So I think that we could be in for, the book is suggesting that, we might see a secession crisis. I think California is, candidate number one before the decade is out, it seems to me. We talked a little before about this. I was trying to think about the forest fires, in the last several months or even years, and how that plays into the calculations of secession, which I don't want to be glib, but, would be complicated, thorny, possibly irresolvable in a peaceful way. So the obstacles to secession are massive, but assuming that we cut through most of them, what's massive climate change fueled natural disasters like forest fires suggest, which obviously people have dealt with in Oregon as well, about a state's ties to the federal government. On the one hand, it seems to me that it would make a state more reliant on federal largesse, for disaster assistance and whatnot. But you also have Trump, who may be gone soon, but Trumpism, will remain, I think, threatening to cut off federal aid to states like California that have not supported him politically. If he were to get away with that, or if a future president were to get away with that, in my mind, that seriously undermines the value of the union to your average Californian or Oregonian.
Yeah. And I guess one of the ththings that this is sort of a related way of asking the same question or approaching the same issue is that, and you do a beautiful job of pointing this out, that the Electoral College, the nature of the Senate, these things are sort of baked into our structure precisely to resist secessionist impulses that were present at the time of the Constitutional Convention. They were baked in essence to appease, to sort of make Southern slave owners feel that they could safely enter into a union with Northerners who were resistant to their economic, who were resistant. But it has come to feel like some of these mechanisms, for the reasons you just described, so let's say these mechanisms were baked into our way of government deliberately with tension, deliberately to create a kind of unequal balance at the time. But that unequal balance of political power has become so just kind of preposterous in recent years, to where someone like Mitch McConnell has more power over the lives of Californians than anyone else, than anyone in California does. I guess it makes me wonder, is there any way, based on what you've seen of on your sort of read of earlier secession movements, will there ever be any way to convince the part of the country that benefits from that inequality to recognize its sort of dangerous unfairness?
Great question. To me, what it would take is California or other states that are affected by these imbalances taking a much stronger and more assertive stand. And as I say, often secessionist threats succeed. And if California were to say, abolish the Senate or we walk, which would be a massive escalation, of course, maybe you get somewhere with that by playing, what some call constitutional hardball. Just one thing that you mentioned, it is true that the Senate was created as a compromise in order to avoid the dissolution of the Constitutional Convention and of the Union at the time. So it's an attempt to stave off disunion. But I also see the Senate, especially as an enshrinement of colonial era divisions in the Constitution and in American politics now 2.5 centuries later. Because the small state delegates, Delaware at the time, Rhode Island, New Jersey, insisted on having an equal say in the affairs of the new republic, because they saw that without that, they feared that Virginia would take them over, or New York or Massachusetts would take them over. But what is Delaware? What is Rhode Island? What is Wyoming? Some of them, the older ones, are the creations of 17th century royal decrees. Others are the creation of 18th century surveyors or 19th century railroad barons. Like, I personally, and this is what I think the book suggests, that the left, of which I consider myself a member, embrace certain, typically conservative ideas such as federalism. But where I disagree with conservatives is that I don't have much respect for the states as such. I don't think that there's anything important about Delaware or Wyoming. I'm much more interested in regionalism. But it seems to me that the Senate enshrines these colonial era divisions that were so important to people at the time in American politics to this point. And in order to overcome them, in order to avoid the kind of quasi-secessionist ultimatum that I just mentioned California might consider offering, I think we need to, and I write this in the conclusion, unite for the first time, not again, but unite for the first time by abolishing the Senate, the Electoral College, and actually forming one country if we want to stay together, I think that's the only path available to us. As to whether that convinces, residents of Wyoming to give up their great privileges that they have, I have no illusions that that's going to be easy or even possible. But to me, if we want to save the country and keep it united, that's what we would do.
Wow, that's fantastic. Why don't we turn this over to questions? Does that make sense? Anybody anybody out there want to send us a question or speak up, or
I'm
you
happy
can
to
do
read
it.
questions in the chat if you want to type them out, or feel free to
No.
hop on. Let me,
Yeah, here we go. Let's hear from Kevin Starr.
Hey, I once showed up at a literary meeting just after he died, and people were glaring at me because of my name tag. Is there currently any real momentum in California or the West or Cascadia or anywhere else for at least a symbolic secession?
I guess I'll answer. No. I think as Daniel was saying, the wind was kind of taken out of Yes California's sails when Marinelli, the leader that you mentioned, actually about 6 months or so into the campaign in the spring of 2017, publicly kind of gave up his leadership role and said that he was permanently moving to Moscow. And this kind of underlined for everybody the ties between the organization and Putin. And so, there's not been much support for secessionism, probably less than if you had asked me or probably Daniel in November or December of 2016, I would have thought it would be more of a thing right now. But what we have seen is California kind of assume this mantle of state resistance to the federal government in a way that, to an extent, on a scale that I don't think we've seen since, the battles over civil rights in the 1950s and early 1960s. The Attorney General has sued the Trump administration more than 100 times, massively, outdoing Republican Attorney Generals like in Texas during the Obama administration. Gavin Newsom has took to calling California a nation state earlier this spring. And his predecessor, Jerry Brown, used similar kind of language. To me, it's not serious. They're not, he doesn't mean that it's an actual nation state. But again, it's the impulse. It's the attraction to that kind of language. The really quite quickly growing attraction to that kind of language in California, on the left, but also across the political spectrum. That's very interesting to me. And again, suggests that these stories, these themes of disunion might not be as, in the past or as, I'm missing a word, but as we might have thought. I think it makes this question of secession and the Union very relevant and worth thinking about, for each of us, what it means to us and whether we would, what we would be willing to give up in order to see it, stay together.
I really like the way you phrase that at the end of the book of, what is all this worth? What is all this for? I mean, there's a really nice, you do a very nice job of asking every individual to sort of explore the question for themselves of what is country for? What is unity? What is union for? Why are we involved in this big bargain anyway? Jeff W. asks, what do you make of the left's idea to add more states?
I like it. I like it a lot. I'm for it. I would say not only should we add more states, I think we should combine states like North and South Dakota, which have no business being, separate states. And we're only split in the 1880s to give Republicans at the time an advantage in national politics. So adding states has always been a political, endeavor. But Washington D.C., Puerto Rico, I'm for it. I'm not really convinced that it's going to be possible or that it's going to happen. But yeah, no, I think it would be another good step to take before pulling the plug.
I'd love to hear you that idea I just brought up about the question that each sort of individual citizen has to ask themselves about what the bargain of nation is for, what the bargain of unity is for. I'd love to hear you sort of talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit.
there's more to this thought. I'm glad you picked that out. There's more to this thought than I actually put in the book. It kind of came from my wrestling with two quotations that I'd come across that made opposite points about this. So in the 1840s, Emerson was kind of reading, Ralph Waldo Emerson was kind of a major intellectual impetus for me towards this project. And he's got a quote in his diary from 1844 when the country is being torn apart by this debate over whether Texas should be annexed. At that time, a independent republic. Should it be joined to the Union? Most Southerners were for it because it would expand the land for slavery. Most Northerners were opposed for the same reason. Emerson was opposed, and it was bitterly dividing the country. And some Northerners were even talking about secession if Texas annexation went through. And so Emerson's responding to this. His neighbors are talking about maybe we should secede from the Union. And he says, that would be a shame. We were just beginning to feel our oats. To break up the Union would be to diminish every man's importance. So Emerson sees being part of this large union, which at that time, wasn't nearly as large or much less as powerful as it is today, but he saw that as giving the individual, which was his concern, much more importance in their own personal life and in their own mind. So that's one quote. And then the other is from James Madison, who, kind of flip-flopped throughout his career quite a bit. But this is from a moment in the 1790s when he's starting to turn against the Washington administration and forming an opposition, Democratic Republican Party with Thomas Jefferson, which is more interested in localism, states' rights, limited government. And he says that being part of, I don't have the exact quote, but being part of a large government might actually make the individual less significant, because their voice, their influence, their vote is outweighed by so many other people. So I've just working on the book was my way of kind of working through my own feelings about that. Michael mentioned this road trip that my wife and I took in 2012, which was 4 months, 37 states we hit, 30,000 miles or something. And it was just, this was before I had the idea of the book, but it was incredible to get a sense of the size of the country. To me, that's, traveling cross country by car, by train is an experience every American should have, just to feel in their bones the size of the country and to see how one state blends with another, how one region blends with another. And I remember us talking at the time that it seemed absurd that it was one country. It very obviously wasn't. Which doesn't mean that it's easy to draw lines on the map to say where it should divide. But so I don't have a very clean answer to this. The book, as you've probably sensed, is kind of steeped in this kind of ambiguity or wrestling with myself about the question, because in writing it, I went back and forth every single day about how I felt about the Union and about secession. Some days, given the outrages that were going on, kids in cages and stuff, is, end it, pull the plug, it's over. Other days, it was more of the Emerson feeling of, that'd be a terrible loss. So more than coming down one way or the other in the book, which I ultimately found impossible to do, I hope that it gives readers, food for thought to come to that kind of determination for themselves, to kind of add up the entire history of the country and draw an equal sign under it and decide what it comes down to in terms of their own feelings about national unity. Does it mean anything in itself? Or as at the beginning, is it solely a means to certain ends? And if that's the case, then if those ends are not being served, then one has to wonder why we, insist on maintaining it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A very long non-answer.
No, it's a good answer. It's a real answer. Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Barbara, do I see you? Any question? No? Oh, all right.
I think Brian's good. Brian Allen.
Brian Allen.
Hey folks, I'm coming from or sitting up here in Nevada City, California, which was actually just the subject of a recent article in the San Francisco Chronicle around sort of a mini civil war of culture taking place just within this community here in Nevada City, Grass Valley, regarding, just sort of a disconnect between more left-leaning folks, potentially newcomers around here, and longtime locals who kind of have a little bit more of a conservative outlook, but also, potentially, less of a big government outlook as well. And I know, you know, in mentioning the road trip and the notion of the United States not really being one country. I'm curious about your thoughts. I mean, even California as not, you know, being one state, and the differences so strongly felt between certain areas within the states. Growing up in the East Bay myself, I was kind of surprised to come out to where I live now in Nevada City, which a friend of mine once described as being more like Calabama in its sort of, you know, certain political outlook and background. And I'm just wondering your thoughts around how, you know, some of these ideas about California as a nation state, it could be something that, is this an area where maybe the left-wing and right-wing ideologies will actually find some common ground in wanting that independence?
Great questions, great questions. A few things. One, you know, I'm struck by you're talking about California's internal divisions, because there's a line in the book where I found somebody in the 1840s talking about California as divided between North and South. South was much closer to Mexico, you know, geographically and you know, by affinity, and less interested in forming this independent nation that others were talking about. And somebody quotes scripture saying, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." You know, 15 years before Lincoln uses the phrase about the country as a whole, somebody's using it about California itself. And of course that persists. You know, the other thing I want to say is that my idea about possibly breaking up the Union, should it ever come to that, the point would not be to form these kind of ideologically homogenous units, because to me that's how you get, you know, not ethnic cleansing necessarily, but the cleansing of a certain sort and violence. The idea is not to only live with those that you agree with. You know, I have cousins here in Brooklyn where I live who are, you know, very much the opposite of me politically. And I don't think that either of us should have to leave our home in any kind of rejiggering of the American map. The idea to me is that by bringing things down to a more local level, it might be more democratic. You might be able to get more done. It might be more efficient as a form of government, of governance. And not everybody would be happy at every time. You know, my cousins here would not be very happy with what was going on. And perhaps your more conservative neighbors in Nevada Valley would not be happy either. But, you know, people in Jackson, Mississippi might, you know, be discontented with what's going on in the Neo-Confederacy, for sure. So, you know, the idea is not to form, you know, these monolithic units so much as to bring it down to a more human scale, you know, in Kirkpatrick Sale's famous phrase, and enable us to actually, you know, work through our differences and come to terms and come to some solution. Yeah, you know, it seems to me that the lesson of the last decade, which I consider a lost decade for the United States, is that arguing over everything in Washington and trying to sort everything out in one city, you know, it hasn't worked and probably is not going to work. So, you know, possibly bringing things down to a more local level, you know, what some have called, you know, a new federalism might be the way to go. There's one other strand of what you had said that I wanted to address. Oh, about left and right. Yeah, I mean, here we are. It's the same point. You know, I do think that this could be possibly the kernel of some kind of merging of left and right, because this is something that, you know, progressives and conservatives have both talked about, you know, increasingly in the last 4 years and even longer ago than that. And in that way, it's kind of a return to the colonial era, which is when I see that the one thing that Americans had in common was the desire to have nothing to do with one another. We might be going back to that kind of, as we were saying at the beginning, you know, disunion as kind of the natural state of things in the United States.
We have a question in the chat from Bill White. You mentioned the left perspective, but I hear more from the right, e.g. Idaho, Eastern Washington, etc. Can you comment about the right conservative perspective?
Yeah, presumably on separatism. There are strong movements in the inland Northwest. You know, the Northwest is very interesting because it has two secessionist movements kind of moving in parallel with one another on different sides of the Cascade Mountains. You know, Cascadia on the coast and what's called, you know, it goes by different names. Some call it, I think, the State of Liberty would be a new state. Others use the phrase American Redoubt, which is kind of a white nationalist vision of, you know, white Christians should flock to the Rocky Mountains in Idaho and Montana and establish a refuge from the fall that is coming for, the United States. So I'm well aware that there are, conservative, even much more reactionary than that, separatists in those parts of the Northwest. And there was a version of the book where the last chapter was going to be sort of a travelogue, where I would kind of leave my studies behind and venture out on another road trip. It was kind of just an excuse to go on another road trip, and visit the Vermont separatists and visit the Californians, the Hawaiians that want to secede from the Union that they never really wanted to join in the first place. And I was kind of dreading having to sit down with these neo-Nazis in Kalispell, Montana, who want to form this American redoubt. I ultimately didn't end up writing that chapter. But yeah, there's definitely right-leaning separatist movements as well, which to me only makes it likelier that something is going to crack at some point if both sides want it. There's a quote I'll just end with. There's another quote in the book from the 1840s, which is that disunion. It's from an abolitionist who says disunion will happen. Calhoun wants it at one end of the Union, and Garrison wants it at the other. Calhoun, the great spokesman for slave owner interests, and William Lloyd Garrison, kind of the leader of the abolitionists who wanted the North to secede, to protest and undermine slavery. And indeed, disunion did come. Because both sides, to some extent, wanted it, or wanted things to be brought to some kind of boiling point or crisis, so that the country could move on.
I think Brian Allen is up in Nevada City, has probably seen what I've seen driving through the Sierra, which is we have, what is it, the state of Jefferson? You've seen those signs? There's a California version of those right-wing secessionist movements as well, conservative.
Yeah, I wrote a section on this on Jefferson. I ultimately had to cut it from the book because I ultimately, it's a book about seceding from the Union, not state separatist movements, which is the whole other subcategory. But yeah, there's a very interesting story about Jefferson, which is that they were really making moves to actually secede from the Union in 1941, and they set up roadblocks on the road leading into the area, and were prepared. The political officials supported it, and they were pretty much ready to pull the trigger, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and they just couldn't. They couldn't do it. But they actually got pretty close.
Oh, right on. Well,
we have a hand raised.
Barbara?
Yeah, I don't know if this has anything to do with what we're talking about, but I'm thinking about where Trump said that it was up to the states to get personal protective equipment and to gear up for COVID. That wasn't the federal responsibility. And the states were often saying, no, we can't do that by ourselves. We're fighting against each other, and only the federal government has the clout to be able to get this efficiently. And
I think it's totally on point. I don't know. What do you think, Richard?
I wrote a piece about this for the New York Times in April about COVID and federalism and the possibility of disunion. And what I was talking about then was the formation of these multi-state compacts in the spring. There were 3 of them in the Northeast, the Midwest, and on the West Coast. 17 governors in total joined these regional associations to coordinate the purchase of protective equipment and the institution of economic lockdown strategies, so that everybody knew that the states are porous and the states couldn't handle any of those tasks alone. What was interesting to me was that in the absence of federal leadership, the total abdication really of the Trump administration in dealing with the problem, the states realized that their powers, their abilities were inadequate to the task, and they kind of naturally, in this moment of crisis, landed on these regional associations as the solution. And what's interesting to me about that is in the age of climate change, in an age of a unreliable and I think increasingly dysfunctional federal government, I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that, of a resort to regional solutions and even like formal arrangements between governors, possibly permanent institutionalized ones, some of which would have to be ratified by Congress. Others would not be. as a way of dealing of coping with these crises that the federal government is unable to. It seemed kind of a natural way of doing business in this era. And though it came at a moment of emergency, and perhaps had Hillary Clinton been president, it would not have been necessary, or Biden or something, it still strikes me as interesting that I think more and more government agencies are recognizing the importance of these regions, 8 to 12 or so of them. That's the way the Federal Reserve is organized by I forget the exact number, 11 or 12 regional banks. The Department of Agriculture recognizes these regions. It seems to me that if our federal arrangement, as it currently stands, falters and fails, that might be the thing that rises to take its place, which would not be a breakup of the union, but kind of a breakdown, a devolution.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Really interesting too that it's that those regional lines so naturally were drawn, so quickly and naturally drawn along these lines that feel intuitively right, and have for so long. I think they've been quite effective. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And some of them, are along these lines of these imagined countries from American history, these lost alternatives, roads not taken, basically. Just at the very beginning, you mentioned that one thing you like about the book is that it goes through American history and gives you a different take on these events. The way I kind of consciously conceived it in my mind was that it's an X-ray of American history, where everything that is white becomes black and everything that's black becomes white. So instead of the story, as you see in a lot of, one-volume histories of the United States, it's the story of the coming of the nation, or the rise of and formation of the nation. Mine is kind of a history of the constant possibility of it not being a nation. So it's kind of a history of these lost alternatives, and it's all true. But I kind of wanted it to read like science fiction or alt history, but kind of a true version of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, do we have any last questions?
Give me a stumper.
Okay.
All right.
What about the dollar? That's the one I cannot answer. What happens to the U.S. dollar? It's just.
Boy, who knows? Well, thank you all for showing up.
Right on.
And
Very
thank you,
interesting.
Daniel
Thank you.
and Richard, for a really wonderful event and conversation. That was really enlightening.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for the questions, everybody.
Yeah.
Kevin, thanks for coming.
And I posted a link there in the chat, so feel free to click that and go over and buy Richard's wonderful book from Annie Bloom's Books, or your local independent bookseller if you have a favorite where you're living. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you later. Take care.
All right, right on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.